So I've been doing some reading, well, a lot of reading, about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And aside from your regular online research, I got my hands on the Windsor file, which details the great lengths that the monarchy and British government at the time went to suppress the details about the extent of their alleged involvement with the Nazis. I also got my hands on the FBI files on the couple, who were under surveillance by the FBI during multiple visits to the US, with the earliest documents I found dating back to 1940. And I've been reading The Traitor King by Andrew Loney, which is a very well-researched book and full to the brim with facts about Edward and Wallis. We've always known that significant parallels exist between the Windsors and the Sussexes. We've even discussed a few in previous videos. But the more I researched, the more striking patterns would emerge, particularly when it comes to things that Meghan and Harry have done in the past couple of years or so. Some similarities we're already familiar with. For instance, much like Meghan and Harry, Edward and Wallis were exceedingly extravagant, obsessed with status and wealth, and led quite a vapid existence. And like Meghan and Harry, they too played the upstage the royals game many times. For instance, Edward and Wallis announced their engagement on the eve of King George VI's coronation, making it incredibly difficult to argue, at least in my opinion, that it wasn't done on purpose. Just like Meghan and Harry are now doing almost an entire century later. With the most recent and painfully embarrassing, exceedingly cringe-worthy attempt for Meghan to outshine, to upstage the ray of sunshine herself, the beautiful Catherine, Princess of Wales, and her appearance after months spent in recovery at this year's Trooping the Colour. I'm sure you've already heard of this by now. I mean, I think everyone has, and I also made a community post about it in case you're one of the few people who haven't heard about this. But Meghan did exactly what we expected her to do, except she really lowered the bar. Are you ready for this? Drum roll, please. Jam and dog biscuits. She released a supposedly new flavor of jam and dog biscuits.
Stop it. Get some help.
And the Windsors did this more than once themselves, by the way. They also just happened to pick King George's birthday, June the 3rd, as their wedding date. Again, making it incredibly hard to argue that this wasn't done on purpose. And above all else, just like Meghan and Harry, the Windsors yearned for a life that could have been. There's a lot more where this came from, but I'll be doing a deep dive into their similarities and their lifestyles and even their differences in a future video as part of this new series. This is the first video, part 1, of a new series I have dubbed the Sussex-Windsor Files, after the Windsor file, of course. Although, if you are looking for a video about how they met and the nature of their relationship in particular and the abdication, I would direct you to the very first video I made on this topic a couple of years ago now, called The Original, which I will be linking below and above. So if you haven't seen it, feel free to check it out. But be aware that that video was told through Wallis's eyes, because we were using letters that she wrote to various people in her life about how she saw things. So we know people self-edit all the time, especially when they don't want to be viewed unfavorably. For today's video, which as I said is part 1 of the Sussex-Windsor Files series, we will be discussing Edward and Wallis's quote-unquote royal visit to Nazi Germany in 1937 and the many parallels that exist between their worldwide peace movement, I kid you not, that is the exact name that was given to their intended tour of the world, and Harry and Meghan's worldwide privacy tour. A publication called The Hill published 3 articles about Harry and Meghan being a threat to national security, with these articles being the impetus for this Sussex-Windsor series, by the way. Now, these are relatively old articles by now. I'm sure you've heard other creators discuss them at some point. So I'll just provide a summary to give some context to this whole Edward and Wallis, Meghan and Harry comparison. In a general sense, the articles, which I will be linking in the description box if you want to read them, discuss how Meghan and Harry are posing a national security threat not only to the UK, but the Commonwealth. And the authors argue by extension the US and its allies by their constant attempts at painting the UK and the monarchy as an inherently racist country and institution, and by attempting to set up a rival court in America. For today's video, the relevant article is the most recent one about their trip to Nigeria, titled Harry and Meghan's Heart of Darkness. And this article discusses how Meghan, in her decision to bypass the UK and fly direct to Nigeria, which is in a region of interest to China and Russia, helped to bolster the Russian and Chinese agendas to destabilize the Commonwealth by playing, quote, the role of the aggrieved royal outcast bearing the self-proclaimed scars of modern-day British racism. Now, I'm just reading what these American authors have written. I don't dabble in politics, at least not on the internet or not publicly, but I don't think it would be news to anyone to say that China and Russia are not the only world powers that are engaging in disinformation and misinformation tactics and trying to destabilize regions. America's hands aren't exactly clean, and neither are the UK's or Australia's or Canada's, etc. And I briefly touch upon this in a recent video I made called The Crisis. Meghan and Harry are a part of a much bigger censorship agenda. But I digress. These articles fired up my memories of reading about Wallis and Edward's involvement with the Nazis. And I just couldn't resist delving deeper into this topic. But before we proceed, you guys know the drill, you know what's coming. A disclaimer. I have to approach this topic very delicately because throughout it, Hitler and the Nazis will be thoroughly discussed. And despite Harry's stupid choice of costume 20 years ago, I am in no way alleging that Meghan and Harry are akin to Nazis or Nazi sympathizers. I really want to make that clear. I am also in no way comparing Nigeria or any other country mentioned as part of Harry and Meghan's worldwide privacy tour to Nazi Germany. Any comparisons made are strictly related to Edward and Wallis on a personal level, so their attitudes, their personalities, their choices, how the royal family and the British government dealt with them, and their desperate desire to be seen as relevant royals on the world stage. All right, capiche? We're all on the same page. Onwards. The year is 1937. A pair of newlyweds, fresh from their honeymoon, have accepted an invitation by the German Labour Front to tour Germany, presumably so that the Nazis could demonstrate how Germany overcame economic strife after World War I. The story goes that Edward wanted to learn about these measures so that he would one day return to Britain as, quote, the champion of the working class. And knowing how pompous and elitist Edward was, you can see how this hypocrisy, or this duality rather, is comparable to Meghan and Harry's intense case of savior complex. You know, their little spiel about wanting to help the little person and giving a voice to the voiceless and uplifting minorities, when we all know, it's clear as day, that all they care about is their image and status. So whether that was true in terms of Edward and his motivations, well, as with a lot of things, unfortunately, historians disagree on a lot when it comes to Edward and Wallis. Some of them pen entire books that are akin to love letters to the couple, while others barely stop short of calling them Nazis. And that's the unfortunate reality when it comes to history. There are so many differing accounts, so many variations of what happened, that it becomes quite difficult to filter fact from opinion. So for instance, with Edward's motivations to visit Germany, it wasn't just his desire to help the working class. Some say it was Edward's greatest desire to give Wallis a royal experience, to rejuvenate his standing and prove to his bride that he lost nothing. He would also say that it was to strengthen Anglo-German relations post-World War I by attempting to sway Hitler with his many charms to avoid a second world war. When I read that, I remembered how Harry supposedly pitched to the executives at Spotify about a podcast where he would interview world leaders, world powers like Trump and Putin, about their childhood and how it affected them. Because Putin and Trump would gladly sit down and bare their hearts to Prince Harry. Now, Edward, who, despite being restricted from the front lines, again, another parallel, because we know that, look, I can't say we know. Sources, people from within the British Army who served alongside Harry, have been quite vocal about how he was coddled and how he was called Bunker Prince because he was just safely stowed away in bunkers while all hell broke loose around him. So Edward's experience of the military during World War I was quite similar because, well, he was the heir, so they had to make sure he was unharmed. But he always did proclaim that he was decidedly anti-war after having apparently witnessed horrors during the First World War. On the other hand, though, he was said to have been a proponent of bombing England to oblivion, forcing it to surrender to Germany so that they may then have peace. So again, you get these two conflicting accounts and you kind of have to follow the crumbs, follow the facts, and piece the puzzle together to decide on what version seems most plausible to you. And hopefully by the end of the series, you can let me know in the comments, and I myself, through putting things together and doing the research, can arrive at a conclusion of our own, without the powers that be telling us what to believe and what not to believe. Edward was also apparently quite a fan of Hitler's dictatorial approach, so much so that he was said to have stated that England could use a Hitler type itself. But I wanted to know, were there more sinister motives brimming beneath the surface, such as perhaps ruining his brother's reign and reinstalling himself as king with the help of the Germans? If you believe what was found in the Marburg files, which are a set of once top secret documents found in Germany relating to the Duke of Windsor's proposed role in World War II, but we'll get to that in a future video, then that version isn't as far-fetched as it may seem. But whatever the motives, we know that the visit, set to take place between the 12th and the 23rd of October 1937, did go ahead. It was first suggested by Charles Bedaux, the multimillionaire Franco-American businessman who owned the Chateau de Condé, which is where Wallis and Edward got married, and who also happened to have extensive business interests in Nazi Germany, leading some to strongly suspect that he was a Nazi spy. The trip was also organized by Hitler's personal adjutant at the time, Captain Fritz Wiedemann, who, interestingly enough, started off as being a sort of father figure to Hitler during World War I, later becoming his adjutant, as I mentioned, as well as a member of the Nazi Party, before eventually falling out with Hitler in 1939. So right on the precipice of the war, and turning into a whistleblower in the US in a desperate attempt to depose him, all while pretending to still be a staunch Nazi supporter the entire time. He even managed to quietly help Jewish immigrants and refugees in Tianjin, China, where he served as a diplomat for the rest of the war after being removed from the US. And by the way, Wiedemann's numerous attempts at warning the US authorities and the UK authorities about Hitler and offering up information to them to bring him down were repeatedly shot down for some unknown reason, which Wiedemann believed led to the dragging out of the war until 1945, and of course, with it, the senseless loss of millions of lives. So quite an interesting story there just by itself. I just couldn't resist putting it in. It fascinated me. I hope you found it fascinating too. But let's get back to Edward and Wallis. Now, Edward was incredibly pro-German, even during his reign as king. He practically regarded himself as German, once stating that, quote, "Every drop of blood in my veins is German." Which does have validity, by the way. I mean, seeing as he hails from a family that were once called Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which is a German name, and which was changed by King George V in 1917 to Windsor amidst intense anti-German sentiments in the country during World War I. Even Wallis, who, along with the Duke, was under constant surveillance by British authorities by this time, was alleged to have close ties to the Nazis, with some even suggesting an affair, which she has denied, with German politician and diplomat Joachim von Ribbentrop while she was still in London. In fact, there was a lot of concern that the Duke was merely a pawn in the hands of his scheming wife, which, again, strong parallels. It's pretty much what people say about Prince Harry today when it comes to how Meghan basically controls him. She's the master puppeteer. But it got even worse for Edward, with some speculating that he wasn't his wife's puppet or pawn, but a pawn of the Nazi regime itself. In another striking parallel, just as the Sussexes backtracked and corrected the nature of their tour and called it private after the British High Commissioner in Nigeria publicly embarrassed them and claimed that they are in no way representing His Majesty's government and this was not an official tour, Edward had informed British diplomat Neville Henderson that his and Wallis's intended visit to Germany was also purely private in nature. Although, as we will find out very soon, right now, and much like Harry and Meghan's tour of Nigeria, the visit actually ended up being royal in all but name. While they were there, the couple were given this special royal treatment. They were whisked off to factories, museums, aerial inspections of Hitler youth academies, and even a visit to a newly built concentration camp. Although, I will say that the consensus when it comes to the concentration camp is that Wallis and Edward were most likely deceived as to the true nature of the building, having apparently been told upon inquiring after it, and I'm warning you, this is quite disturbing. They were told, quote, "That is where the cold meat is stored." The tour continued, and the two countries' national anthems were played practically everywhere the couple went, which of course reminded me of this incredibly awkward scene from Meghan and Harry's Nigeria tour. But in essence, Nazi Germany wanted to project this image of being natural allies with Britain, with hopes of possibly installing Edward as their puppet king. But more on that in a future video. On the penultimate day of their tour, Wallis and Edward took a special train up to Hitler's mountain retreat. And in what must have been a blow to Edward's seemingly fragile yet overinflated ego, the couple, having arrived early, were made to wait while Hitler finished his nap. Bobby. Eventually meeting him at 2:30 p.m. when he woke up. If that wasn't a power play by Hitler to show Edward who's boss, how the mighty have fallen. Perhaps a bit too conveniently, or maybe I'm being a cynic, no records exist of what Hitler and Edward spoke about. We do know that for some reason, Hitler insisted on using an interpreter, even though Edward spoke fluent German. We also know that Hitler was quite impressed with Wallis, saying that he thought she'd make a good queen. He flattered her and played right into her desires to be treated as royalty, with some saying that he even addressed her as Your Royal Highness. She too was quite taken by him, later describing his eyes as, quote, "truly extraordinary, intense, unblinking, magnetic." So, what the rest of us would call a psychopath. Just as Wallis and Edward's relationship in the beginning was heavily censored in the UK at the time, the public basically didn't know about it for a long time, any news of this trip was also censored and kept from the public in the UK. But as for the government and the royal family, of course, they had their spies. And with news of this tour reaching the UK through spies and through the MI5, and especially given the timing of it all, let's not forget this visit was taking place when there were already rumblings about a potential war creeping throughout Europe and the world. The palace and the government were less than pleased, to say the least. King George VI stated that the couple were never to be hosted or entertained in any official capacity in any embassy. And in a string of communications between the king's former private secretary, Alec Hardinge, and senior British diplomat Sir Robert Vansittart, the disdain towards this unofficial and unsanctioned trip was clear. Hardinge wrote that under no circumstances were the couple to be treated as King George's representatives in whatever country they visit. Vansittart agreed and replied that the tours prearranged without a word to the UK are, quote, a bit too much, with Hardinge stating that, quote, nothing should be done to make them appear other than what they are, i.e. private stunts for publicity purposes. And if that wasn't an exact description of Meghan and Harry's tours, you know, whether they're in the US or Nigeria or wherever, then I don't know what is. I could have been reading a description about them. And although there is, of course, no comparison when it comes to visiting Nazi Germany in the 30s and Meghan and Harry visiting present-day Nigeria, I do wonder, having read this now about how annoyed the palace and the government were at the time, whether reports of the current monarchy and the current British government being annoyed at Meghan and Harry's farcical tours are accurate, especially given that they are clearly capitalizing on their titles for their own selfish gain and by painting the monarchy in a negative light at the same time. All that paints a very damning picture of what Meghan and Harry are trying to do. So I can't imagine that the palace and the government are just, blasé about it. And don't forget, as pointed out by The Hill, all these things could potentially play right into enemy hands, the hands of foreign powers who want to see the Commonwealth burn, which I'm sure Meghan and Harry wouldn't mind, having called it the Empire 2.0, because this is a couple scorned. A pair of toddlers who seem intent on setting fire to the very Commonwealth that they both were once so excited to represent, simply for not having their way. I mentioned very early in the video something about a worldwide peace movement. This was to be a world tour where Edward and Wallis would visit various countries, with America being next in line after Germany. And the purpose of this trip? Well, I suppose it's in the name, but the truth is, we'll never know, because a manifesto was slated to be released during their visit to America, except that visit never ended up taking place. Remember Charles Bedaux? Well, he went to America before the couple to finalize the arrangements. And it goes without saying that America was not a fan of Nazi Germany in the slightest. Bedaux himself was quite reviled by labor in the US. And so coupled with these anti-Bedaux sentiments, this spelled a PR disaster for the Windsors, who were attacked, along with Bedaux, for their fascist tendencies, proven to the Americans by their recent trip to Germany, in a manifesto that was issued by the Baltimore Federation of Labor. And if you didn't know, Wallis Simpson grew up in Baltimore, so this is technically her home turf. And they didn't want her. Now, removing the Nazi aspect of it, purely your home country turning against you because of your own antics, you see the parallels? From there, the onslaught, particularly against Bedaux, actually persisted until he was forced to entirely abandon the whole concept of the tour. And so Edward ended up canceling the trip entirely, and the worldwide peace movement died before it was really even born. Now, the parallel here is the reports emanating right after Meghan and Harry's Nigeria trip, the trip that was supposedly so successful that other countries are now clamoring to have them come over to bask in the glory of the Montecito grifters. One such country that has been particularly named time and time again by the Sussex PR machine is Ghana. Now, this is where we start getting into very uncomfortable territory for me, because I don't like to deal in rumors. I like to report on facts, things that can be verified. In this instance, I cannot vouch for what I'm about to say. So in any other circumstance, I wouldn't be including rumors, but because of the parallels, I just thought I'd mention it at least. And then if someone out there has a source that can verify this rumor, please let me know in the comment section below. So I have seen unverified reports floating around the internet that the president of Ghana has not only outright denied inviting Meghan and Harry to his country, but has apparently claimed that he would never entertain the notion of inviting two people who have so publicly disrespected their own families. So yeah, I suppose time will tell, and we shall see whether this worldwide privacy tour that they have announced, their intention to visit multiple more countries, will actually take place, or whether, just like their predecessors, it might never see the light of day.